Elon Musk helps homeless man. What happens next will amaze you. The evening crowd bustled through the city streets, their hurried footsteps echoing against the tall buildings. Among the swarms of polished suits and trendy outfits, Walter, a weathered homeless man, sat on a tattered blanket outside a luxury cafe. The soft glow of the cafe's chandeliers reflected in the glass windows behind him, casting an ironic light on his worn and patched-up jacket. A small tin can sat beside him, empty except for a few stray coins that jingled softly whenever the wind shifted. Walter wasn't one to beg outright. He had his dignity, after all. His sign read simply, "Hard times. Anything helps." It wasn't flashy or emotional, just honest. But honesty wasn't exactly a currency people valued in a place like this. He adjusted the scarf wrapped tightly around his neck, trying to block out the chill that seemed to seep deeper into his bones every day. The stream of pedestrians moved around him as if he were invisible. Occasionally, a sympathetic glance would come his way, but most people didn't even look. It was just another day, Walter thought, until he heard the sharp, impatient clack of shoes against the pavement. He looked up slowly, instinctively bracing himself. A man in a tailored suit stood over him, his polished leather shoes just inches from Walter's knees. Walter recognized him immediately. It was the same man who'd harassed him several times over the past month. Daniel Royce, the owner of the cafe. Royce was a man who oozed wealth and entitlement, his confidence bordering on arrogance. His piercing eyes locked onto Walter with a mixture of disdain and irritation. "You again," Royce said, his voice dripping with disgust. He glanced around, as if checking to see who might be watching this interaction. "Didn't I tell you to leave? You're scaring off my customers." Walter sighed, already weary. "I'm just sitting here, not bothering anyone," he said quietly, his voice gravelly from years of hardship. "Not bothering anyone?" Royce scoffed, crouching slightly so they were at eye level. The motion was theatrical, his movements exaggerated. "You're ruining the image of my cafe. People come here to enjoy their drinks in peace, not to see this." He gestured vaguely at Walter's appearance. Walter's jaw tightened. "I'm not breaking any laws. This is a public sidewalk. Don't get smart with me," Royce snapped, his tone sharp. "You think you can squat here because no one has the guts to tell you off? Well, let me make it clear. This is my territory. I don't want you here." Walter didn't flinch, though every word felt like a slap. "I've got nowhere else to go. And whose fault is that?" Royce countered, his voice growing louder. A few passersby slowed their steps, glancing over at the scene. Royce noticed and straightened, a smirk tugging at his lips. He turned slightly, addressing the small audience with a flourish of his hand. "You see this? This is what's wrong with the city. People like him, always sitting around, waiting for handouts instead of getting a job." The onlookers murmured, their faces a mix of discomfort and disinterest. Some quickly looked away, walking faster to escape the awkward scene. Others lingered, their curiosity keeping them rooted in place. Walter felt his cheeks burn, not from shame but from anger. He clenched his fists tightly, forcing himself to stay calm. He'd learned long ago that reacting only gave men like Royce more fuel. "I don't need your judgment," Walter said quietly, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. "Just leave me be." But Royce wasn't finished. Emboldened by the small crowd, he stepped closer, towering over Walter. "Leave you be?" he repeated mockingly. "No, I'm gonna make sure you never come back here again. You're a leech, and I'm done letting you leech off my property." "It's not your property," Walter said firmly, though his heart pounded in his chest. "This sidewalk belongs to the city." Royce's face twisted into a sneer. "You want to play lawyer now?" He bent down and snatched up Walter's sign, crumpling it in his fist. "This garbage is what's bringing down my business." Walter reached out instinctively, grabbing for the sign, but Royce pulled it away, holding it just out of reach. "What are you gonna do, old man?" he taunted. "Fight me for it?" The crowd grew slightly larger, the tension thickening in the air. A few people had their phones out, filming the scene. Walter noticed but didn't care. All he could focus on was the anger radiating from Royce and the humiliation clawing at his insides. "Give it back," Walter said, his voice low but firm. Royce smirked, holding the crumpled sign in front of Walter's face before tossing it into a nearby trash can. "There. Problem solved." Something inside Walter snapped. He pushed himself to his feet, his knees wobbling slightly but his resolve steady. For a moment, Royce seemed taken aback. He hadn't expected Walter to stand up to him, literally or figuratively. "You think you're better than me because you've got money?" Walter said, his voice shaking but loud enough to be heard. "You think tearing me down makes you a big man?" Royce laughed, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Spare me the sob story," he said, brushing off Walter's words. "You're just another bum who doesn't know his place." Walter opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Royce shoved him backward. The force wasn't enough to knock Walter down, but it sent a jolt through his body. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Don't touch me," Walter warned, his voice low and sharp. Royce stepped closer, his smirk returning. "What are you going to do about it?" The tension was palpable now, the air thick with the unspoken question. Would Walter fight back? The crowd seemed frozen, their eyes darting between the two men. Phones continued to record, their lenses capturing every detail. Walter clenched his fists, his body trembling with the effort to hold himself back. He wanted to swing, to make Royce feel even a fraction of the pain he'd endured. But he knew better. He wasn't about to stoop to Royce's level, not here, not now. Royce leaned in, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "That's what I thought. You're nothing." Walter stared at him, his chest heaving with restrained fury. He knew he couldn't win this battle, not in the way Royce expected. But as he glanced at the phones in the crowd, an idea began to form. He didn't have to fight Royce physically. The truth would do that for him. Walter stood his ground, his chest rising and falling as he stared into Royce's smug face. The humiliation of the moment burned deep, but something shifted inside him. He wasn't going to let this man, this bully with a shiny suit and an overinflated sense of power, crush him. Not again. Royce stepped back slightly, as if daring Walter to try something, his polished smile sharp enough to cut. "See, this is the problem," Royce said loudly, gesturing toward Walter like he was some kind of exhibit. "People like you, always angry, always waiting for someone to blame. But the truth is, you're where you are because of you. No one else." The crowd murmured, some clearly uncomfortable with the spectacle, while others were riveted, their phones still trained on the scene. Walter's gaze darted to the onlookers, and for a fleeting moment, shame threatened to overwhelm him. But then he saw it. A young woman in the back, her phone pointed squarely at Royce, her brow furrowed in disapproval. She wasn't watching for entertainment. She was documenting. Walter's anger shifted into something sharper, more focused. He could use this. "I ended up here because of people like you," Walter said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "People who think money gives them the right to step on anyone in their way." Royce's smirk wavered for a split second before he recovered. "Oh, give me a break," he said, rolling his eyes. "Your sob story isn't going to work on me. Let me guess, bad luck? A rigged system? It's always someone else's fault, isn't it?" Walter took a deep breath, his hands shaking with restraint. "You don't know anything about me," he said evenly. "You don't know what I've been through, what I've lost. But people like you don't care. All you see is someone you think is beneath you." Royce let out a short, derisive laugh. "You're right. I don't care," he said, stepping closer, his voice dripping with venom. "Because people like you are a burden. You sit here expecting sympathy, taking up space, dragging the city down. Do you think anyone actually wants you here?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Walter caught a glimpse of the young woman frowning deeply, her phone still trained on Royce. Others in the crowd were shifting uncomfortably, their expressions a mix of disbelief and discomfort. Royce, oblivious to the shifting energy, continued his tirade. "This city wasn't built for people like you," he sneered. "It was built by people like me. People who work hard, who create jobs, who... Walter cut him off, his voice louder and firmer than it had been all night. You didn't build anything, he said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. You bought it. You bought it with money you made off people like me. People who worked hard for you until you squeezed every last drop out of them. The crowd went silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Royce's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he stared at Walter. You're delusional, he said, his voice quieter now but no less venomous. You're just a bitter old man who can't accept the fact that he's a failure. Walter felt the weight of the insult, but he didn't falter. He took a step closer to Royce, his voice low but firm. You can call me whatever you want, but I'm not the one afraid of the truth. Royce's smirk returned, though it was thinner now, less sure. Truth, he said mockingly. What truth? That you're a leech? That you're nothing without people like me? Walter didn't respond. Instead, he reached down and picked up the torn pieces of his cardboard sign, holding them up for the crowd to see. The words, though ripped and crumpled, were still visible. Hard times. Anything helps. This is all I've got, Walter said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. And you tore it up like it was nothing. Like I'm nothing. The crowd shifted, their discomfort growing. A few people lowered their phones, their expressions softening as they looked at Walter. Royce, however, scoffed, his impatience showing. Spare me the theatrics, he said, waving a dismissive hand. You think holding up that sign makes you some kind of martyr? It's pathetic. No, Walter said, his voice steady. What's pathetic is someone like you thinking they're better than everyone else because they've got money. What's pathetic is tearing people down to feel powerful. Royce's face twisted in anger, his composure slipping. You don't know a damn thing about me, he snapped, his voice rising. I earned everything I have. Everything. You think you're entitled to respect just because you've got a sob story? Respect is earned, old man. And you haven't earned a damn thing. Walter stared at him, his chest tight with anger and sadness. He wanted to argue, to push back, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Royce wasn't listening, he never had. The tension reached a boiling point, the silence between them heavy and charged. And then, from the back of the crowd, a voice broke through. That's enough. The voice was calm, even, but it carried a weight that silenced the murmurs instantly. Everyone turned to look, including Walter and Royce. A man stepped forward, his hood pulled low over his face. He moved with quiet confidence, his hands tucked into his pockets. Royce squinted at him, irritation flashing in his eyes. Who the hell are you? He demanded. The man didn't answer right away. He stopped a few feet away from Walter, his gaze shifting between him and Royce. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured but firm. I'm someone who's tired of watching people like you stomp all over everyone else. Royce's jaw tightened, his irritation flaring as the stranger stepped closer. The man's calm demeanor seemed to unnerve him, though he masked it with a sharp laugh. Oh, another one of you bleeding hearts, Royce said, shaking his head. Let me guess, you're here to defend him too? Maybe throw some spare change his way and feel good about yourself for a day. The stranger didn't rise to the bait. He simply stood there, his hands still in his pockets, his expression unreadable. The crowd had grown quieter now, their attention fixed on the unfolding scene. Walter, still clutching the torn pieces of his sign, glanced at the stranger with a flicker of confusion and curiosity. I'm here, the man said evenly, because I don't like bullies. Royce's smirk faltered for a moment before he recovered. Bullies? He repeated, his tone mocking. I'm not a bully. I'm a businessman. And as a businessman, I have every right to protect my property from freeloaders. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering Royce's words. Protecting your property by harassing someone who's just trying to survive? He asked, his voice calm but pointed. That's your idea of good business? Royce's face reddened slightly, but he forced a laugh. You don't understand how the world works, do you? This isn't about some bleeding heart morality. It's about image. My customers don't want to see This, he said, gesturing toward Walter with a flick of his hand. It's bad for business. The stranger's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, there was a hint of steel in his tone. What's bad for business, he said, is being exposed as a petty tyrant who kicks people when they're down. Royce's laughter died in his throat, replaced by a cold, angry glare. Listen, I don't know who you think you are, he said, stepping closer to the man, but you've got no right to tell me how to run my business. If you've got a problem, take it somewhere else. The stranger didn't flinch, didn't move. His gaze locked onto Royce's, unyielding. The tension crackled in the air, and the crowd shifted uncomfortably, their murmurs growing louder. Phones were still out, recording every second of the confrontation. Walter watched the exchange in silence, his mind racing. He didn't know who this man was or why he'd stepped in, but there was something about him, something steady and unshakable. It was a stark contrast to Royce's blustering arrogance. Royce's patience snapped. Fine, he said sharply, turning his attention back to Walter. You want to play the hero? Go ahead. But you're wasting your time on someone who doesn't deserve it. He reached down suddenly, grabbing Walter's tin can and flinging it across the pavement. The sound of coins scattering echoed in the air, followed by a collective gasp from the crowd. Walter stiffened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. For a moment, he thought about fighting back, about giving Royce a taste of his own medicine. But before he could act, the stranger stepped forward. That's enough, the man said, his voice louder now, commanding. Royce turned back to him, his expression dark. What are you going to do about it? He sneered. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few quick taps, he began recording, turning the camera toward Royce. Say that again, he said, his tone calm but daring. Tell us all why you think it's okay to treat people like trash. Royce's face twisted with fury, his composure slipping. Turn that off, he barked, reaching out as if to grab the phone. The stranger took a deliberate step back, keeping the phone trained on Royce. Why, he asked. Afraid of the truth getting out? Afraid your customers might not like what they see? The crowd murmured in agreement, and a few people even began to cheer quietly. Royce looked around, his anger giving way to unease as he realized the tide was turning against him. This is ridiculous, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. You don't understand the first thing about running a business. Do you have any idea how much I've invested in this place? The risks I've taken? The sacrifices I've made? The stranger raised an eyebrow. And that justifies tearing down someone who's already struggling? It justifies protecting what's mine, Royce snapped. This city is full of people like him. People who sit around waiting for handouts instead of working for what they want. I'm not going to let him drag me down. The stranger shook his head, his expression one of quiet disappointment. No, he said softly. You're dragging yourself down. The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Royce opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, someone in the crowd stepped forward. You're wrong, the young woman from earlier said, her voice steady. She held up her phone, which had been recording the entire time. This isn't about business. It's about you thinking you're better than everyone else. And it's disgusting. Royce glared at her, his face flushed with anger. Mind your own business, he snapped. This is my business, she shot back. It's everyone's business when someone like you abuses their power. The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder. Royce's gaze darted around, his confidence wavering as he realized he was losing control. The stranger said nothing, his phone still trained on Royce, his silence more damning than words. Walter watched the scene unfold, his heart pounding. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. Royce took a step back, his frustration boiling over. Fine, he spat. You all want to play heroes? Go ahead. But don't think for a second this changes anything. He turned on his heel and stormed back toward the cafe, slamming the door behind him. The crowd cheered softly, their support washing over Walter like a warm tide. The stranger turned to him, his expression softening. Are you okay? he asked quietly. Walter nodded, though his throat felt tight. Yeah, he said, his voice rough. Thanks to you. The man smiled faintly, but he didn't say anything else. He simply offered Walter a hand, helping him to his feet. Walter stood unsteadily, brushing off his worn coat and scarf as the stranger helped him up. The crowd, though dispersing, still lingered with quiet murmurs and glances toward the cafe. Walter noticed some faces looking at him differently now. Not with pity, but with solidarity. The stranger stood beside him, silent but steady, like a wall between Walter and whatever trouble might come next. Inside the cafe, Royce paced furiously, visible through the tall glass windows. His suit jacket flapped as he gestured wildly at his staff, his lips moving fast as if barking orders. Walter couldn't hear what he was saying, but the frustration on Royce's face was unmistakable. The tirade he'd unleashed on Walter had been meant to solidify his control, to stamp out any defiance. Instead, it had only made him look small. Walter's heart was still pounding. The humiliation he'd endured was fresh, but so was the strange and unfamiliar feeling of having someone stand up for him. He glanced at the man beside him, trying to piece together why he had stepped in. "Who are you?" Walter asked finally, his voice quiet but curious. The stranger smiled faintly, his eyes flickering toward the cafe. "Just someone who doesn't like seeing things go unchecked," he replied. His tone was calm, unassuming, but there was an edge to it, like someone who'd seen this kind of thing before and refused to let it slide anymore. Walter studied him, trying to decipher the confidence in his words. "Well, whoever you are," he said, nodding. "Thank you." The man gave a slight nod but said nothing more. Walter thought about pressing further, but the sound of a door slamming cut through the air like a gunshot. Royce had stormed out of the cafe, his face flushed with anger, his steps sharp and deliberate. His jaw was tight, and his eyes darted toward Walter and the stranger like a predator sizing up its prey. "You're still here?" Royce barked, his voice echoing off the nearby buildings. Unbelievable. Walter felt a chill run down his spine, but he held his ground. The stranger remained beside him, his stance unchanging, his gaze unwavering as Royce approached. "You think you've won something, don't you?" Royce sneered, his words aimed at Walter but clearly intended for everyone still watching. "You think because you've got this wannabe hero on your side, you can just squat here and make a scene? Let me tell you something, you're nothing, and no one is going to change that." Walter clenched his fists, his anger bubbling beneath the surface. He wanted to yell, to fight back, but he knew it wouldn't help. Royce wanted a reaction, something to validate his cruelty. But before Walter could respond, the stranger stepped forward. "Stop," he said simply, his voice cutting through Royce's tirade like a blade. Royce turned to him, his sneer deepening. "And who do you think you are?" he snapped. "You think you can just waltz in here, play white knight, and fix the world? Newsflash, this isn't a charity." The stranger tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but calculating. "It's not a charity," he said evenly, "but it is a public sidewalk." Royce let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh great, another genius who thinks he knows the law." He took a step closer, his face inches from the stranger's. "Listen to me. I've built this business from the ground up. I've poured my blood, sweat, and tears into it, and I won't let people like him." He jabbed a finger toward Walter. "Drag it down." The stranger didn't flinch. "You built this business?" he asked, his tone curious but tinged with something sharper. "Or did you just buy it?" The question landed like a slap. Royce's face twisted with indignation. "I earned it," he hissed. "Every penny." The stranger didn't respond immediately. He let the silence hang, his gaze locked on Royce's. Then, slowly, he said, "And how much of that was earned off the backs of people like him? People you crushed to climb higher?" Royce blinked, his composure faltering for the first time. "You don't know anything about me," he snapped, his voice rising. "I worked for everything I have. Unlike him." The stranger's eyes narrowed, his calm exterior cracking slightly. "I've seen enough of people like you to know exactly how you got here," he said. "And it's always the same story. Step on anyone who gets in your way. Treat people like obstacles instead of human beings. And when someone finally stands up to you, you throw a tantrum. The crowd, which had thinned but not entirely dispersed, murmured in agreement. Phones were out again, recording every word. Royce glanced around, his frustration mounting as he realized he was losing control of the narrative. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "You think you can lecture me? You don't know anything about business, about responsibility. You think the world runs on charity and good intentions. It doesn't. It runs on power." The stranger tilted his head again, his expression unreadable. "And what happens when that power runs out?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Royce stared at him, his jaw working as he struggled to come up with a response. The crowd was watching intently now, their eyes shifting between the two men like spectators at a boxing match. Walter stood silently, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to say, what to do, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone. Royce's composure cracked further as the stranger's words sank in. "This isn't over," he snapped, his voice shaking slightly. "I'll make sure you regret this. Both of you." The stranger didn't respond. He simply watched as Royce stormed back into the cafe, his movements stiff and jerky with barely contained rage. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the street. The stranger turned to Walter, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Walter nodded, though his legs felt like jelly. "I don't know what just happened," he said, his voice rough, "but thank you." The stranger gave him a small, reassuring smile. "It's not over yet," he said. "But it will be." Walter frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the cafe, his expression unreadable once again. Walter followed his line of sight, a strange sense of anticipation building in his chest. Something was about to happen. Walter could feel it. Walter stood on the sidewalk, trying to process the stranger's cryptic words. The crowd, still lingering outside the cafe, began to buzz with hushed conversations. Phones remained poised, recording every second of what felt like an inevitable escalation. Walter didn't know what to expect, but his instincts told him the situation was far from over. Inside the cafe, Royce could be seen pacing back and forth near the counter. He barked orders at his staff, gesturing wildly as if the very presence of Walter and the stranger outside was a personal affront to his authority. The cafe patrons avoided looking at him directly, their uneasy glances darting toward the window instead. Royce's anger was palpable, a storm ready to burst. The stranger stood calmly beside Walter, his gaze fixed on the cafe. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his hoodie, his expression unreadable. Walter, still holding the torn remnants of his sign, couldn't help but glance at him. "Are you sure about this?" Walter asked quietly, his voice tinged with both gratitude and doubt. The stranger didn't look at him. "What do you think is going to happen if he keeps getting away with this?" he said, his tone even but firm. Walter didn't respond. He didn't need to. He'd spent too many years being brushed aside, ignored, and belittled by people like Royce to know the answer. If no one stood up to him, nothing would change. The cafe door slammed open, cutting through the tension like a gunshot. Royce stormed out, his face red with fury. This time he wasn't alone. Two burly men in black suits followed him, their expressions cold and unfeeling. Walter's stomach sank. He recognized the type, hired muscle, the kind of men who didn't ask questions before throwing punches. Royce stopped a few feet from Walter and the stranger, his posture stiff with righteous indignation. "I warned you," he said, his voice loud enough to carry over the murmurs of the crowd. "You had your chance to walk away, but you decided to make this a spectacle." The stranger tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You made it a spectacle the moment you decided to humiliate him in front of all these people," he said, gesturing toward Walter. "You could have just walked away." Royce's smirk returned, though it was more of a snarl. "Walk away? This is my street, my cafe, my rules. And if you think you can just waltz in here and make a fool out of me, you've got another thing coming." He motioned to the two men behind him. "Remove them," he said sharply, his voice laced with venom. The larger of the two men stepped forward, his broad shoulders blocking out the light from the cafe behind him. He cracked his knuckles, his expression blank but menacing. Walter took an instinctive step back, his heart pounding. The crowd tensed, some gasping, others raising their phones higher to capture what was about to happen. The stranger didn't move. He stood his ground, his hands still in his pockets, his gaze locked onto the approaching man. "You don't want to do this," the stranger said calmly, his voice carrying just enough weight to give the man pause. The large man hesitated for a fraction of a second, his brow furrowing slightly. But Royce's sharp voice cut through the moment. "Do your job," he barked. The large man reached for the stranger, his massive hand closing the distance with deliberate force. But before he could make contact, the stranger moved. It was quick, almost imperceptible, a subtle shift in weight, a step to the side. The man's hand grabbed empty air, and before he could react, the stranger pivoted, twisting his arm and forcing him off balance. The man stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him to the ground with a thud. The crowd erupted into shocked gasps and cheers, their phones capturing every second. The second man stepped forward, his fists clenched, but he hesitated, his eyes flickering between his downed partner and the stranger. "Don't," the stranger said quietly, his voice low but commanding. "It won't end well for you." The second man hesitated for a moment longer before stepping back, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. Royce's face turned an even deeper shade of red, his frustration boiling over. "Useless," Royce spat, glaring at the two men. "Absolutely useless." He turned his attention back to the stranger, his voice rising in anger. "You think this makes you a hero? You think embarrassing me in front of my customers changes anything? You're nothing. Just another nobody trying to feel important." The stranger's calm demeanor finally cracked, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer to Royce. "You've spent your whole life tearing people down to make yourself feel big," he said, his voice sharp and unyielding. "But all you've done is show everyone how small you really are." Royce opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their disapproval of Royce clear. For the first time, Walter saw uncertainty flash across Royce's face. It was fleeting, but it was there. The stranger didn't stop. "You can talk about power and success all you want," he continued, his voice unwavering. "But at the end of the day, it's not the money or the buildings or the suits that people remember. It's how you treat others. And right now, all these people are going to remember you as a bully who couldn't handle being called out." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy electrifying the air. Royce stepped back, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the public's judgment. He glanced around, his gaze darting between the stranger, Walter, and the crowd. For the first time, he looked unsure, his bluster replaced by a faint flicker of panic. The stranger didn't say anything more. He simply stepped back, his presence still commanding but no longer aggressive. Walter watched, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Royce turned on his heel, his movements stiff and jerky, and stormed back into the cafe. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing down the street. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in celebration. Walter turned to the stranger, his voice shaking. "Who are you?" he asked. The stranger glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You'll find out soon enough," he said. Royce stormed back into the cafe, his face a mask of fury. He barked orders at his staff, demanding the windows be covered and the doors locked to shut out the circus. But his bluster couldn't hide the growing cracks in his confidence. Outside, the crowd was alive with energy, their phones still raised, their whispers carrying one name through the air: Elon Musk. Walter, still standing beside the stranger, heard it too. His brow furrowed as the realization began to creep in. He looked at the man beside him, the casual hoodie and jeans, the calm but unshakable presence. Pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but it felt almost too unbelievable to say aloud. "Wait," Walter said, his voice hesitant. "You're not." The stranger turned to him, the faintest flicker of amusement in his eyes. "I was hoping to keep it quiet," he said, his voice softer now. "But I guess that's out the window." Walter's jaw dropped. "You're Elon Musk?" he asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and awe. The man Elon smiled faintly, giving a small shrug. "Guilty." Walter blinked, his mind racing. He had seen Musk's face on TV and in headlines countless times, but seeing him here in person, standing up for someone like him, it was almost too much to process. Why are you here? Why me?" Elon's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet sincerity. "Because people like him," he said, nodding toward the cafe, "get away with this kind of thing all the time. And people like you are the ones who pay the price." Walter opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say, how to thank someone who had just turned his entire world upside down. Inside the cafe, Royce's tirade continued, but his staff and customers were no longer paying him much attention. The murmurs of Elon Musk's name had reached their ears too, and they began peeking out the windows, their curiosity growing. Finally, Royce seemed to notice the shift in the room. He turned sharply, his gaze following the direction of their stares. Through the window, he saw Elon standing beside Walter, his calm demeanor radiating an authority that Royce couldn't match. For a moment, Royce froze, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing. Then his disbelief gave way to indignation. He pushed through the cafe doors, his steps heavy and determined, as if sheer force of will could overpower the situation. "You've got to be kidding me," Royce said as he approached Elon. His voice was loud, but the edge of uncertainty was unmistakable. "This is a joke, right? You're not really. You can't be." Elon turned to him, his expression neutral but unwavering. "I am," he said simply. The words landed like a punch to the gut. Royce's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He glanced at the crowd, which had grown even larger now, their phones capturing every second. The murmurs were louder, and the realization was written on every face. Elon Musk was here, and Royce had picked the wrong fight. I didn't know," Royce stammered, his confidence crumbling. "I didn't realize it was you." Elon raised an eyebrow. "Does it matter?" he asked. "Would you have treated him any differently if you did?" Royce's face flushed, his anger and embarrassment warring for control. Look, this is all a misunderstanding. I didn't mean any harm. I was just trying to protect my business." "By tearing down someone who's already struggling?" Elon asked, his voice calm but cutting. "By humiliating him in front of everyone? Is that your idea of protection?" Royce spluttered, his words fumbling as he tried to defend himself. Look, he was loitering. That's all. I didn't mean for it to escalate." Elon tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "It escalated because you made it escalate," he said. "You could have walked away. Instead, you decided to make him a target." The crowd murmured in agreement, their disapproval growing louder. Royce glanced around, his discomfort plain as he realized he had no allies here. Even his hired muscle had retreated to the cafe, unwilling to face Elon or the crowd. Walter watched in silence, his heart pounding. Seeing Royce squirm, his arrogance stripped away, felt like vindication. But it wasn't enough, not yet. Elon stepped closer to Royce, his voice dropping slightly, enough that only Royce and Walter could hear. "You think this is about him being in front of your cafe?" he asked. "It's not. It's about power. And you've been abusing yours." Royce swallowed hard, his bravado evaporating. "Look, I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his voice quieter now. "I'll make it right." Making it right isn't up to you anymore," Elon said, cutting him off. "It's up to him." He gestured toward Walter, who blinked in surprise. Royce turned to him, his expression a mix of desperation and forced humility. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't mean to upset you. I'll make a donation or something, to help, whatever you need." Walter stared at him, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, disbelief, and something he couldn't quite name. He glanced at Elon, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "Apologies don't mean much when they're just words," Walter said finally, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "If you're serious, prove it." Royce hesitated, clearly reluctant, but the weight of the crowd's judgment and Elon's presence left him no room to argue. He nodded stiffly. "Fine," he said. "What do you want me to do?" Walter didn't answer immediately. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of control, a sense that he could dictate what happened next. And he wasn't about to waste it. Walter stared at Royce, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For years, he'd felt powerless, a man stripped of his dignity and voice, shuffled to the edges of society. Now, for the first time, all eyes were on him. He glanced at Elon, who stood silently at his side, offering no instructions, no interference, just quiet support. Royce shifted uncomfortably under Walter's gaze. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a desperate attempt to salvage what was left of his reputation. The crowd, still recording every second, waited with bated breath. Walter finally spoke, his voice steady but laced with quiet resolve. "You want to make this right?" he said, his words deliberate. "Then stop pretending like you're doing me a favor." Royce blinked, his confusion momentarily eclipsing his embarrassment. What do you mean?" Walter gestured toward the cafe, the polished windows reflecting the glimmer of neon lights from the street. "This place," he said, his voice gaining strength, "isn't just yours. It's built on the backs of people like me. People who work long hours, who clean up the mess, who do the things no one else wants to do. You think you're above us, but you wouldn't last a day without us." The crowd murmured their agreement, some even clapping softly. Royce's face flushed a deeper red, his discomfort palpable. Walter wasn't done. "You don't owe me a donation," Walter continued. "You owe me respect. And not just me, all the people like me who you look down on because they don't fit your idea of success." Royce opened his mouth, but no words came out. Walter's voice, calm and firm, cut through whatever excuse Royce had been ready to offer. "You want to make this right? Start treating people like human beings," Walter said. "Because one day your money and your power won't mean anything. And all that'll be left is how you treated the people who couldn't fight back." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy washing over Walter like a wave. He felt his chest tighten, but this time it wasn't from anger or despair. It was something new, something unfamiliar, pride. Royce, visibly shaken, stumbled back a step. He glanced at the crowd, at Elon, at Walter, his expression a mix of anger and humiliation. For a moment, it looked like he might lash out again, but the sheer weight of public judgment kept him rooted in place. Royce started, his voice trembling. "I'll do better. I swear." Walter tilted his head, studying him. "We'll see," he said simply. Elon stepped forward then, his presence quiet but commanding. "Apologies are a good start," he said, his voice even. "But actions speak louder. You're gonna have to show people that you've changed." Royce swallowed hard, nodding stiffly. "I will," he said, though the words sounded hollow. Elon's gaze remained steady, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We'll hold you to that." Royce flinched under Elon's scrutiny, the full weight of his reputation and influence pressing down on him. He glanced at the crowd one last time before retreating into the cafe, his steps hurried and uneven. Walter let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging slightly as the tension began to dissipate. The crowd began to clap again, their cheers growing louder. A few people stepped forward to shake Walter's hand, offering words of encouragement and support. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. Elon turned to him, a small smile on his lips. "You did good," he said quietly. Walter nodded, still overwhelmed by the surge of emotions coursing through him. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Elon replied. "Just remember this moment. You stood up for yourself. That's not easy." Walter felt his throat tighten, but he managed a small smile in return. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough but heartfelt. For everything, Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. This isn't over yet, he said. But it's a start. The two men stood there for a moment, the cheers of the crowd fading into the background. Walter didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a future worth looking forward to. The crowd slowly began to disperse, their murmurs of excitement and disbelief rippling through the night air. Walter stood quietly beside Elon, still trying to process everything that had happened. Royce's humiliation had been public, undeniable, but Walter knew the fight wasn't entirely over. Actions spoke louder than words, and promises meant nothing without follow-through. Elon turned to Walter, his hands resting in his pockets. "You okay?" he asked. Walter nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Just overwhelmed, I guess." Elon smiled faintly. "Understandable. It's not every day you stand up to someone like that and win." Walter chuckled softly, the sound rough but genuine. "I don't know if I won," he said, glancing toward the cafe. "But it feels good to not be stepped on for once." Elon's expression turned thoughtful. "It's more than that," he said. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for a lot of people. People who've been where you are, people who are still there." Walter frowned slightly, processing the weight of Elon's words. I'm just a guy trying to get by," he said quietly. "And that's why it matters," Elon said. "Because people like Royce think they can get away with this kind of behavior. They don't expect anyone to push back, especially not someone they see as powerless." Walter nodded, a sense of quiet pride settling over him. For so long, he had been defined by what he'd lost. His home, his business, his dignity. But tonight, for the first time, he felt like he'd reclaimed a piece of himself. Elon glanced at the cafe, his expression unreadable. "There's one more thing I need to do," he said. Walter blinked. "What do you mean?" Elon didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began typing. Walter watched as Elon's fingers flew across the screen, his expression calm but focused. Within seconds, a notification buzzed through the phones of several people in the crowd. Walter frowned as the crowd erupted into excited murmurs. "What did you do?" he asked. Elon turned the phone toward him, showing him the tweet he had just posted. "Just witnessed an incredible act of courage. We need to do better for people like Walter who've been let down by the system. Let's start with real change. More soon. #Justice for Walter." Walter's eyes widened as the implications sank in. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Elon shrugged. "I wanted to. And trust me, this is just the beginning." Walter didn't know what to say. The idea of his name, his story, being shared with millions of people was overwhelming. But there was something else in Elon's tone, something that hinted at a larger plan. "What's next?" Walter asked hesitantly. Elon smiled, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "You'll see," he said cryptically. Before Walter could press him further, the cafe door opened again. This time, Royce emerged with a stiff, uncomfortable expression. His earlier bluster was gone, replaced by a forced humility that looked as ill-fitting as his expensive suit. He approached cautiously, his gaze flickering between Walter and Elon. "I've given it some thought," Royce said, his voice tight, "and I'd like to make things right." Walter raised an eyebrow. "How?" Royce cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm donating a percentage of my profits to local shelters," he said, "and I'm offering free meals to anyone in need, starting tomorrow." The crowd murmured in approval, though Walter could tell Royce's words were motivated more by self-preservation than genuine remorse. Still, it was a start. "And Walter," Royce added, his tone grudging, "if you ever need anything, my door is open." Walter stared at him, his emotions a mix of satisfaction and lingering resentment. "I'll believe it when I see it," he said finally. Royce nodded stiffly, clearly eager to end the conversation. He turned and retreated into the cafe, leaving Walter and Elon standing in the glow of the neon lights. "You think he means it?" Walter asked quietly. Elon shrugged. "Probably not," he said honestly. "But now he knows people are watching. And that's enough to keep him in check. Walter nodded slowly, the weight of the evening settling over him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he felt like he had a chance to shape it. As the crowd began to thin, a young woman approached Walter with a shy smile. "I just wanted to say, you're an inspiration," she said. "What you did tonight, it matters." Walter felt his throat tighten, but he managed a small smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough but sincere. Elon clapped a hand on Walter's shoulder, his touch steady and reassuring. "Let's get you somewhere warm," he said. "We've got work to do." Walter blinked. "Work?" Elon's smile widened. "You don't think I'm just going to tweet about this and walk away, do you?" he said. "This is just the beginning." Walter stared at him, a flicker of hope and disbelief in his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt like his life was moving forward, not just surviving, but living. As they walked away from the cafe, the neon lights fading behind them, Walter couldn't help but smile. Whatever was coming next, he was ready for it.